Ireland. Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is The Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, called To The Point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
A ship has been seized. The French ambassador has been summoned to the Foreign Office. The Elysee Palace is threatening escalation. If only the Duke of Wellington wasn't so busy dealing with sewage amendments in the House of Lords. We'll be exploring the new fishing dispute, or fight, as Macron's maritime minister described it yesterday. We'll also have some budget reaction from the perspective of real people. All that in just a few minutes. It's 9 o'clock and you're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood.
I'm Rhiannon Jones. This is your news at 9 o'clock. France's ambassador to the UK has been summoned to the Foreign Office as the row over post-Brexit fishing rights escalates. Catherine Colonna will be questioned this morning about threats of retaliation by Paris, which have been labelled as disappointing and disproportionate by Downing Street. The row began after France complained of a lack of licences for French boats to fish in UK waters. France is yet to release a British scallop vessel detained yesterday, and French prosecutors say the boat's captain will be called to court next August. Barry Dias, who represents British fishermen, says this is just President Macron flexing his muscles post-Brexit.
It's got very little to do with fishing. This is about high-level politics against the background of the French presidential election. So I don't think that the issue really lies within our hands or the UK's hands. What we can do is proceed with what we're doing already, work through the licenses, the eligibility criteria, which vessels are eligible to fish in UK waters, grant them a license, and keep working at that technical level.
US President Joe Biden will meet Pope Francis at the Vatican today to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change and poverty. Mr. Biden arrived in Rome, leaving a fraught domestic agenda in limbo back at home. It's after his fellow Democrats abandoned plans to vote for the president's nearly $3 trillion spending plan. Joe Biden will meet privately with the Pope before wider talks begin. He will then travel to Glasgow for the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26. England could soon become the first country in the world to license e-cigarettes as a medical product to quit smoking. They're a step closer to being prescribed on the NHS for the first time under new plans. It comes after the British health regulator updated its guidance for people who want to quit smoking. They say e-cigarette manufacturers can now submit through the same approvals process as other medicines. Insulate Britain activists have staged another protest this morning, gathering on the M25. Essex police say a number of people have blocked the road between junctions 28 and 29. The eco group claim 14 protesters have caused major disruption on the motorway in several locations. It follows after an injunction was put in place by the High Court, banning the group from obstructing traffic. MPs are warning the Crossrail project is facing an £150 million funding gap. The Commons Public Accounts Committee expressed doubts over how and when taxpayer loans will be repaid. That's after the collapse in fares revenue due to the coronavirus pandemic. It's predicted the cost of finishing the project is now at £18.9 billion. Once the Elizabeth line opens, services will run from Reading and Heathrow in the west to Shenfield and Abbeywood in the east via central London. Coronavirus restrictions in Wales will be strengthened in a bid to curb infections, which are the highest in the UK. First Minister Mark Drakeford will reintroduce some measures, including guidance around self-isolation. Adults and young people aged 5 to 17 will soon be asked to isolate until they receive a negative PCR test. That's if someone in their household has symptoms or tests positive. COVID passes will also be extended to theatres, cinemas and concert halls. Facebook has officially rebranded itself as a wider company called Meta. It's designed to represent the social media network's expanding business plan into what they're calling the metaverse. That's an online world where people can meet, play and work virtually. The core Facebook service will still remain unchanged. And archaeologists have discovered Roman artefacts during HS2 works in Stoke Mandeville. They made a once-in-a-lifetime discovery of statues and other pieces at St Mary's Church. Dr. Rachel Wood, the lead archaeologist on the site, called the findings significant.
Really rare finds in the UK. To find one stone head or one set of shoulders would be really astonishing, but we have two complete heads and shoulders as well as a third head as well, and they're even more significant to us archaeologically because they've actually helped change our understanding of the site here before the medieval church was built.
I'll be back with the headlines in half an hour. For now, it's back to Tom with the briefing.
Welcome back. Today we'll speak to two experts on how real voters are reacting to the budget and on how the Tories might fare at the next election, even on who our next Prime Minister may be. We'll of course also be exploring this extraordinary dispute with the French, speaking to the Cabinet Minister responsible for our maritime industry, George Eustace, as well as Jersey's External Relations Minister, Senator Ian Gorst. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining us now is someone who's been speaking to real voters at a time of Budget Week. Luke Trill is the UK director of More in Common. He conducted a focus group with the voters of the Red Wall seat, Rother Valley, to see what they thought of the budget. And I'm delighted to say he joins me now. First of all, how are real people in these really key swing constituencies reacting to this budget?
Well, it's good news for the government. People were really struck by the optimistic tone that the Chancellor took in the budget. They really liked hearing about some of the tangible benefits that the UK might get for having left the European Union. I think they feel like they've waited quite a long time to get what they voted for. And they also are intrigued about the promise of this regeneration of areas that have been left behind for quite a long time. So they talked a lot about wanting to see that money going into their high streets. So that's the good news. I guess the bad news is that a lot of what came out of the budget was met with scepticism from the audience that we spoke to. There was a lot of, that's great, but is it really going to happen? Am I really going to feel the benefit? Because in a lot of cases, they felt like they'd heard it all before. And they're particularly worried about the short term. So that's what's going to happen this winter. You know, we had a couple of people who'd already had their energy suppliers go under and they'd be moved on to more expensive tariffs. Other people knew those who'd seen the £20 universal credit being cut, and that was having an impact on their lives. So there was optimism about the future, a little bit of scepticism, and then a real concern about the very short term, this feeling that we're heading for quite a difficult winter, and perhaps the Chancellor didn't do quite enough to reassure people that he was going to get them over that hump.
That's very interesting, some short-term concerns. I also was reading what you wrote in The Times a day or two ago about this live focus group that you conducted, where people were sort of hearing all of these spending pledges, thinking, oh, that's good, there's billions going in here, billions going in there. But then they started to ask a question of the Chancellor that's normally asked of Labour politicians. They started to ask, where is all this extra money coming from? Has the Chancellor done enough to sort of say that there is no magic money tree, that this money is coming from genuine, real sources, whether it be tax rises or growth?
I think that was the big question mark that we saw in the budget. As you say, when this focus group were watching the budget, there was lots that they welcomed, and sort of every individual announcement, people thought, that's great, things about the early years, about money for the NHS, money for high streets and local areas. But as we went on and they just kept seeing those numbers flashing up on screen, people sort of took a bit of a breath and like, gosh, this is a huge amount of money. I think perhaps far more than they'd expected to see. And there was that concern that at the end of the day, is it going to be me that ends up footing the bill for all of this? They were aware that there's a new tax rise coming in next year, which is going to affect a lot of people, and they understood why that was important to fund the NHS and social care. But there was a feeling that combined with this worry about the cost of living in the short term, are they going to find that it's them that end up footing the bill for what was quite a big giveaway?
It's interesting. Very often when a tax rise is announced, people in the abstract say, oh, no, that's quite right, the NHS should get more money. And then when they realise actually where that money's coming from, i.e. out of their own pay packets, somehow that support seems to drip away. Is there any indication that as these tax rises actually start to bite, that will hurt this government more? People will think that actually this is money that's being taken out of their own pockets. As the Shadow Chancellor said on Wednesday, it's almost as if this is a two-man con man effect where the Prime Minister promises money and then the Chancellor pinches that money from their own pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could poll or focus group a whole range of tax rises and, as you say, get support in the abstract. I think very often it's only when you see that deduction coming out of your pay packet that you really start to weigh it up. And I think, again, the worry for the government must be less about the tax rise on its own, but whether it's a sort of triple, quadruple whammy with the tax rise, with high inflation, with those energy bills, with people just feeling the household finances are a little bit tight, and this is another thing on top of that. And I think that's the real risk. I think if a lot of these kind of short-term price adjustments have worked their way through, by the time the tax rise comes in, the government will be in a better position, but they must be worried about this sort of triple, quadruple whammy affecting people's standard of living.
Now, just finally, you were talking to voters in a marginal constituency. They're saying they were having some concerns about whether the Conservatives can deliver all of this money that they were promising. What do they think about the Labour Party?
In truth, very little came up in the group. I mean, they were very focused on the government, and I think their view of the government is, there were people in that group. The group, we'd selected them because they were the group that had swung most of the Conservatives at the last election, and I think, a few of them said they sort of voted Conservative for the first time because they liked this new vision for the country and they really didn't like Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. They were reserving judgment on whether that was a good decision. They recognised that COVID and the coronavirus have knocked things off course and they're going to give them a bit longer before forming a judgment. But when it came to the Labour Party, I think, the main thing that the group expressed was actually just a bit of a feeling sorry for Keir that, this was supposed to be his big moment, responding to the Chancellor on the budget. And of course, he got COVID just before and couldn't do it. So there was that sense of feeling just a little bit sorry for the Labour leader that he hadn't had that chance to show himself.
That's very interesting. Sympathy for a leader is potentially not exactly the emotion that you want to incite from people. I wonder if there's a twinge of Theresa May there, where people sort of felt very sorry for her by the end, sort of this dogged leader running a minority parliament, but sort of in the end you don't want to vote for a leader you feel sorry for. You want to vote someone who you respect or potentially see of as a leader.
And it's certainly true that looking the other way, that when you talk in groups about the Prime Minister, that sort of sense of real optimism and a positive vision for the country really comes through. So, absolutely, you don't want a leader that the public feels sorry for because, actually they're the people who need to be leading the country and driving us forward. And it's very clear that positive vision that Boris embodies, which I think actually you saw the Chancellor channeling as well in his budget speech, that really cuts through to people because, we've had a very difficult 18 months. People really talk about, in focus groups about their personal experience, the struggles they face. They now want to see actually, this country is going to be motoring forward. They want positivity. And I think that will be a challenge for the opposition, is how they oppose and do their job and win people's trust, but doing it in a way which, again, projects that positive, forward-looking vision of the UK for over the next few years, rather than simply just being oppose.
Well, Luke, Trill, it's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
These focus groups, these specific swing voters are going to be so important in terms of our national conversation as the months and indeed years go on. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here on The Briefing. Cheers.
Thank you.
Now, sticking with the budget and specifically the man who delivered it. Rishi himself describes himself as a low-tax Conservative while jacking taxes up. Once the most popular politician in the country, how does he fare now? Well, joining me to discuss this is Kieran Pedley, the polling expert from Ipsos Mori. Welcome to the programme, Kieran. First of all, Rishi Sunak was at one stage one of the most popular politicians in the country. It seems it's quite easy to gain popularity if you're doling out free cash to lots of people. Is that still the case?
What's interesting about the Ipsos Mori political monitor is that we can track satisfaction with chancellors going back to the late 70s. So you're quite right. Back in March, 59% of the public were satisfied with the job Rishi Sunak was doing as chancellor. Now, to put that in context, only Dennis Healey in the late 70s got better scores. Gordon Brown had got close in the early 2000s, but it gives you some insight into how impressive the public thought Rishi Sunak was. However, there is context to this. Back in March, we were in the middle of a vaccine bounce, so-called vaccine bounce for the Conservatives, and people were feeling pretty optimistic about the way things were going. So we had a net economic optimism score among the public of +2. And that's just a fancy way of saying that essentially 43% of the public thought the economy would get better in the next 12 months and 41% thought it would get worse. But if we fast forward to September, things have changed somewhat. So that net optimism score has gone from +2 to -22. So what we're seeing is a much more negative view amongst the public about the direction of travel in the country. And that's reflected in Rishi Sunak's favourability ratings. So for the first time in October, we found that roughly the same number of people were...
Oh, I'm very sorry. We seem to be having a bit of a connection issue there with North London. But I believe we can show you this graph from Ipsos Mori now. And describing this graph, we can have a look at how Rishi Sunak is actually faring. As you can see, several months ago, huge popularity ticking up, as we were just discussing there, with that vaccine rollout. And indeed, ever since, that popularity ticking down. No sudden drop, but a gradual decrease. And I wonder, how much of this is to do with tax rises? How much of this is the inevitable consequence of profligacy? The question here is whether Rishi Sunak is someone who can back up what he has done with what he's about to do in the future. He continually describes himself as a low-tax Conservative. And how much of that shine will stay as taxes continue to rise? The tax burden now is the highest that it's been in 70 years, the highest that it's been since Clement Attlee. And the problem here is one of trust, in my view. When a politician says they will do one thing while doing the opposite, people start to trust them less on all matter of other things. When Rishi Sunak says that he's a low-tax Conservative, when he says he doesn't want to jack up taxes and then decides to jack up taxes, that raises question marks, and particular question marks when we know the financial situation of the country. On Wednesday, we heard that the OBR said that the UK economy was growing faster than they thought. Not 4%, but 6.5%. Now, 6.5% growth, as well as reduced scarring, not 3% scarring, but 2% scarring, better economic indicators overall, that delivered an extra £35 billion that the UK Chancellor could spend. £35 billion extra. And yet, he decided to raise taxes anyway, raising them by £15 billion. Now, I don't know how many of you are good at quick maths here at home, but 15 billion is a smaller number than 35 billion. Indeed, what could have happened with this 35 billion windfall is that we could have not raised taxes and still increased spending on public services. Yet this tax rise was decided to go ahead anyway. I'm fairly sure that raises some questions. Let's return now to Kieran Pedley of Ipsos Mori. I believe we've got our connection back up and stable. I want to turn from the Chancellor now, who we have discussed in a bit of depth, to some other figures. How's Boris Johnson doing?
So what's interesting is when we look at favourability ratings in our Ipsos Mori political polls towards Boris Johnson, actually he's not doing too well. It's a net score of -23, which means that 49% of the public are unfavourable towards Boris Johnson and 26% are favourable. Now, when we compare that to Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, he gets similar numbers. So also a score of -23, but with slightly more people neutral or saying they don't know what they think about Keir Starmer. So, for example, 19% are favourable towards Starmer, which is obviously less than Boris Johnson's 26, but then also we find 42% are unfavourable, so again less than Boris Johnson's 49. So I suppose at this point in time, neither the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition are particularly popular with the public, which I think reflects the sort of negative general pessimism that's around in terms of the direction of the country.
Although I suppose in a system that runs on first past the post, the unfavourability potentially doesn't matter as much as the favourability. If you have 45% of people saying that they think this guy's great and 45% of people saying they think this guy's awful, the net will be zero. But in the end of the day, that'll be 45% of people willing to vote for him. Whereas if you had, for example, 30% who think someone's great and 20% who think they're awful, that's still only 20% who'll vote for them, but a negative score. Do you sort of see what I mean here? That favourability matters much more than those who dislike politicians?
Yes, I mean, ultimately in first past the post, it's your supporters that matter rather than your detractors, although hostility to a particular politician and political party can manifest itself in opposition to that party too. And I think Labour struggled with that a little bit under Jeremy Corbyn at the 2019 general election. I mean, I think what will ultimately matter when the next general election comes around, and we don't, of course, know exactly when that will be, is just how the public are feeling about the direction of the country and the government's role in that. I think if we were going to distill politics right now in 2021 into a sentence, we could probably say that people aren't that impressed by the government as it stands. They're a bit pessimistic about the future, but they're not convinced about the Labour Party either at the moment as an alternative. Now, whether that changes in the future remains to be seen, but that's kind of where we are now, I think.
And that's a problem for the Labour Party, isn't it? Because if we're about 2 years into this Parliament, maybe only 1.5 years away from the next election, if we're to believe it could come in 2023. Two and a bit years into the coalition government, the Labour Party was 10 points ahead in the polls. Ordinarily, oppositions get at sort of this midpoint term pretty substantially ahead in the polls. Michael Foot was ahead of Margaret Thatcher. At one point, William Hague was ahead of Tony Blair. Yet Keir Starmer has struggled to get ahead of Boris Johnson. What does that say about the next election?
Well, I think when you ask the public about the Labour Party specifically and Keir Starmer's role in changing the Labour Party, what you typically find is a majority of the public think he's either made no difference or they don't know if he's made any difference. So there isn't really a sense that the Labour Party is changing significantly for the better under Keir Starmer amongst the public. All I would say to caveat that, though, is that we are in somewhat unprecedented times. And we saw back in the 2017 general election, yes, something of a one-off, but how things can change quite quickly, even in a campaign. So I suppose what we need to see is what happens in the next couple of years. I mean, you mentioned Michael Foot, for example, being ahead in the polls. Well, I mean, events change the course of history, don't they? So the Falklands War, for example, turned Margaret Thatcher from someone that was pretty unpopular to someone that was at that time revered and obviously went on to win successive general elections. So what we don't know is what's going to come in the next couple of years with the economy, with Brexit and with other things that we don't know about yet. And it's those things that are going to define the next general election.
Well, the Falklands War, as we were discussing, potentially a Channel Islands war or a fight, as Macron's maritime minister undiplomatically described it yesterday. I mean, potentially that might have some movement in the polls. That might have some consequence for this government. I just want to finally in this conversation ask you about the big climate conference happening next week. COP26, the government's been banging on about it for ages. It seems to be dictating rather a lot of policy in this country. Is the public particularly aware of what's going on in Glasgow?
So the conference, I don't have figures on the conference itself. I imagine that awareness will be there, but superficial. And I suppose the key in terms of how that lands will be what comes out of it. What we do see with our Ipsos Mori polling is that there is strong concern about climate change. So around 85% of the public are concerned about climate change. But recent research between Ipsos Mori and the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation shows that whilst there is broad support for policies that would promote net zero, such as levies on frequent flyers and also subsidising electric cars and other measures such as those, support for those sorts of measures tends to fall when it affects people directly. So as one example, there's like two-thirds of the public.
That age-old story of tax rises, popular in the abstract. When it hits the specific, people are less sure. Well, Kieran Pedley, thank you so much for joining me this morning on The Briefing. Really interesting discussion and really useful looking to the future. Well, something that's happening right now. Macron's maritime minister yesterday described the British-French fishing row as a fight. After seeing a British vessel, she went on after seizing a British vessel, she went on to say, "We need to speak the language of strength." Now the UK is accusing the French of threatening to break international law and the terms of our Brexit trade deal. Well, fight is not the word that I would use, but it is that incredibly aggressive word of the French maritime minister. So how is the UK responding? I'm delighted to say that joining me live from Westminster is the Environment Secretary, George Eustace. Welcome to the programme. And first of all, the French ambassador
Good morning.
Has been summoned to the Foreign Office. Do you think this will be enough to de-escalate the situation?
Well, look, I think it's the right thing to do in the first instance. The background to this is that on Wednesday, France made a number of quite extraordinary threats that basically they would close ports to UK fishing vessels, be deliberately difficult and obtuse when it came to goods going through the border, and actually politicise the fisheries enforcement process. It's really not what you'd expect from a friend and ally. And so the right thing to do in the first instance is to raise it with the European Commission, as we've done so, and to raise it through diplomatic channels, which we are doing. And we very much hope, obviously, that France steps back from the threats that they're making.
How do you respond to that word that Macron's maritime minister has used, fight? Is that a word that you think is accurate to describe what's going on in the English Channel right now?
Well, I don't think it is, but I also think to make these threats is totally disproportionate. So to put this into context, since the end of the transition period, we've licensed almost 1,700 EU vessels. Nearly 750 of them are French vessels. It's about 98% of all of the EU vessels that sought a licence have been granted one. There's a tiny percentage of vessels, around 55 in Jersey, and a similar number in our inshore waters, that aren't able to demonstrate that they have the necessary track record, so they just don't qualify. But it's only about 2% of all of the applications. The other 98% have already got their licence. So just to put it into context, we've applied and the TCA, the agreement in full. We've given a licence to every vessel that was entitled to it, including a very large number of French vessels.
But of course, the French would say it's not that 98% figure, it's around that half figure. They just don't have the paperwork to prove it. A tricky situation, I suppose. In the Telegraph this morning, however, there's been some suggestion of what the UK is considering further than just that summoning of the French ambassador. I want to ask you about the likelihood or the prospect of some of those responses that the UK government is suggested to be considering. A bilateral with President Macron at the G20. Is that something that would really be strong enough to try and de-escalate this situation?
Well, look, as I said, we think in the first instance that using diplomatic channels is the right thing to do. And of course, France, as an EU member, doesn't decide its own fishing policy. That's set by the EU, and the EU represent France internationally when it comes to fisheries. So we're raising it with the European Commission, since they've got a role in making sure France abides by the law and abides by the terms of the agreement. But we're also raising it diplomatically, and we think that is the right thing to do in the first instance. But obviously, if France carries through the threats that they've made, and they've suggested they might be doing this from Tuesday, were they to do that, then obviously we reserve our options to, to respond in a proportionate way in kind.
A proportionate way. Is there anything that you would rule out? The UK has actually deployed the Royal Navy before in terms of fishing disputes. Is that something that you would think to rule out, or is that potentially an option on the table?
Well, I know people often get carried away about involvement of the Navy, but the Fisheries Protection Squadron's the oldest part of the Royal Navy and has always done fisheries work, even when we were in the European Union. So yes, we do have fisheries protection vessels in the Royal Navy, but also other marine assets of that sort as well. But principally, we want to try to resolve this dispute by getting France to understand and accept that those 55 vessels that haven't been granted a licence, probably aren't entitled to one. And if they're able to offer us the evidence that supports the applications, well, we'd process them. But for now, we're trying to de-escalate this, but we're also very clear that if France carries out the threats that they've made, then we will obviously make a proportionate response.
And just finally, the French seem to be threatening to break the terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. They seem to be threatening to deploy arbitrary checks on our lorries to stop our boats being able to dock in their ports. This is sort of perfidious behaviour. Would this jeopardise our understanding and our commitments to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, to that Brexit trade deal?
Well, look, we are committed to it, and indeed we've implemented it. So we've issued nearly 1,700 licences to fishing vessels because they're entitled to access under the terms of the agreement. I think it would be quite a step if France were to, break the agreement and possibly even break EU law in terms of border control posts and how they behave at those posts. That would be quite a significant step for them, and obviously we'll be asking the European Commission to ensure that its member states abide by the law.
It's an extraordinary situation, and one that no doubt we will be continuing to follow very, very closely. George Eustace, thank you so much for joining us this morning on the briefing on GB News. A serious situation as well. Well, coming up, we've got To The Point with Patrick Christys and Inaya Folarin Iman. That's it from me this week. Next week, you'll see us live from COP26 in Glasgow. You won't want to miss it. But before all of that, and indeed before To The Point, here's the weather.
Hello again, good morning to you. A wet start for many, away from the far southeast and far northwest. Persistent rain, turning more showery this afternoon before brighter skies finally arrive in the west later. This weather front has been stuck across northern England, southern Scotland during the last few days. It's finally making some progress east, but it will send another spell of persistent wet weather into parts of Wales, southwest England, northern England and southern, followed by central Scotland this morning. Showers also pushing into eastern England, but all in all, the weather is starting to dry up, albeit very slowly. So further wet weather on top of what's already fallen, southern and central Scotland, parts of Wales, risk of disruption before finally the rain turns more showery and some brightness into Northern Ireland, southern Wales and the southwest later. Staying mild for the time being, but temperatures are going to start to decline over the next few days. Turning wet then as we end the day across north.